Hi, this is Claudia Filos. I'm with the Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington, D.C., and I'm here today to host a discussion with Professor Richard Martin of Stanford University. He's joining us today with some members of our community to discuss the word Mūthos and mythology and the language of heroes, and I'm sure many other beautiful topics will come up in the course of our discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Martin.
Well, thank you, Claudia, very much for hosting, and thanks everybody for joining us. And it's really a delight to be able to talk about Homeric poetry at any point, but I'm eager to hear what you have to say about what you've been reading and rereading, and I'm also so impressed by your devotion to this poetry. It's incredible to me that something composed so long ago, we're not even sure quite how long, but at least 2,500 years ago, is still so incredibly violent, and yet still so incredibly beautiful. I open up this morning my news feed. I have a Google news feed, Homeric, and what I see is an article in the Huffington Post called What Homer's Iliad Tells Us About the Islamic State. And it's a comparison of recent events dealing with ISIS to the Iliad. So, this is the kind of poetry that just never goes away. It's an incredible thing, and it's always a pleasure to talk about it. But some of the things that are raised in the article, if you get a chance, we might want to debate also whether the strain of violence in modern culture has anything to do with what you see in the Iliad. I would dispute a lot of what the author says. The author happens to teach at the War College, but it's interesting that it's still in the news. So let me just say in introduction that what I was interested in when I wrote the book about the language of heroes and am still very much concerned about has to do with the orality of this poetry, with the fact that the poetry itself is a kind of long speech act, that we know from the medium that it was not originally written down or made to be written down, that it was something that was composed on the spot, that it involved live audiences and interactions, kind of like this. Since it is a kind of extended speech act on its own, I thought way back when, well, what if we look at all of the other speech acts inside the poem and get a sense of what it is to speak for these people? Whether it's people in 800 BC or 500 BC, we can't quite pinpoint, but very distant from us in a very alien culture and language. What does it mean to speak for them? Interestingly, at the time, I hadn't thought about this word mythos, but I had to teach, and I was teaching mythology. That was my assignment. And it occurred to me as I'm teaching mythology, I never really investigated where the word myth comes from. And why not start at the beginning? So through the beauty of the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, this repository of all the Greek literature that we have on one CD, I was able to quickly get all of the occurrences of this word that gave us the word myth eventually. The Greek is mythos, M-U-T-H-O-S. And it seemed to be a mess. Looking at the Iliad and the Odyssey, it didn't make sense. People would translate it as word, but then sometimes that wouldn't fit, and sometimes it would be speech. It was all over the map. So I started systematically trying to account for semantics that would include all the instances of the word. And it occurs about 160 times in the Iliad alone, and maybe another 100 times in the Odyssey. So I came up with some ideas about it, but instead of just telling you those, I thought you could do the investigation just as well, given a translation and some highlighting. And so I'm curious what you think, kind of scene by scene in those scenes that I gave, is going on just with this word. And then we could talk about how that might relate to other things in the poem. So shall we go through some of the passages just briefly, and you can react and tell me what you think? The first one was from Iliad 1, the very beginning of the poem.
Yes, thank you so much, Richard. So can I just share a few details for people who are watching? So we're broadcasting live. So just so if people are listening, what we're going to be talking about first is Iliad 1, lines 1 through 52. Okay, and we have a translation that we're using that's available for free. It's an open source translation available on the CHS website and on the Hour 25 website if people want to take a look there in the source book. Okay, so thank you so much. And so let's take a look at that and see what people have been thinking about this passage that Professor Martin has pointed us towards. Any thoughts about Mūthos?
Oh, you mean the passage 1 that says, "Hi, this is Jackie from Boston." This one I loved. It was so clear. To me, it was like the power of silence, you know. As I was saying right before we went live, the 4 passages, Richard, I thought was great because I had this big visual image of a scorecard coming up. Who won, who lost, when it was a draw, when both win. And in this one, it was like Agamemnon zip, crisis 1, you know, because he says not a word, but man, he's got the power. He's got the direct line of communication to Apollo, whereas Agamemnon is just a bag of air. You know, he commands, but it's empty command. So I really like this one, mainly because I thought I understood it. But I didn't know how anyone else reacted to it.
You know, the assignment was to look at it as a close reading, and for the most part, in the past, when I've read the piece, I looked at it as 2 separate conversations, right? Agamemnon and Chryses, and then Chryses and Apollo. But, you know, you asked us to look at it as a close reading. Well, if that's the case, it's actually one dialogue. And as we learned from our 24 of ancient Greek hero in 24 hours, the dialogue doesn't stop because one person departs. Mm-hmm. So, looking at it that way, what occurred to me is that the Chryses had come to the camp as a supplicant, however you say that word, but he didn't behave the way you're supposed to behave. You know, you're supposed to take the person's hand, you're supposed to say a word, you're supposed to speak their name, maybe hold their knees, whatever it takes, and then you ask what you ask. Well, he didn't do that. He walked in and demanded his daughter. I mean, there was pretty words up front, but not the standard behavior. So looking at it that way, maybe that explains Agamemnon's anger, because he was not being approached properly, he was not being respected properly.
Well, Chryses didn't recognize Agamemnon as being his master. I mean, it was just like, you know, I'll go to my real boss, you know. So right. That's what my take was, that, yeah. So that's why the silence, because to say anything would be to verify Agamemnon's power over him, so he doesn't say anything because he's really a non-entity in that. But so, yeah, Agamemnon would probably pick up on that. Sorry, I'll shut up.
No, because I've never really understood his instant anger about the whole issue. But this, for me, explains it better.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole song and dance about how he was in love with the girl, please, come on.
But can I say that I like the idea of Chryses somehow violating Agamemnon's space or his sense of his prestige and his self. And if contrasted with the very end of the poem, which, as people have pointed out, is a kind of mirror image, you know, how does Priam come to ask for his child, who, of course, is the dead Hector? He comes and he not only supplicates, but he kisses the hands of the man who killed his son. So it does seem to reflect back on the first part of the poem. And if an audience has heard something like the Iliad before, kind of like you as an audience, they know the story, and then they hear Iliad 1, they're thinking, this is not like Priam. And also, on the other hand, if you're the priest of Apollo, do you really have to grovel? As you say, you can go to your boss. There's another reason why the Iliad survives, because it's all about power relations in the workplace and in life, authority.
Well, that's beautiful.
You know,
so,
you can also...
Go ahead, Bill, please.
You can also add Thetis to that list. When she approaches Zeus, it's that whole proper way of doing things and the whole power play, and which gets into Achilles changes the minds of the gods. I mean, who's got the power? Just because his mom's on her knees doesn't mean she doesn't have the power at the moment. Which crises could have had if he'd done it properly.
So, Richard, can I ask a question? Because I feel like our conversation... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jack. I didn't see your hand. Please.
Oh, okay. At line 25, we have the word Mūthos, kataron depimuthon etele. So epitelo means to lay upon, or to say strongly. And I don't mean to steal thunder from the discussion of 4, but that word comes up in the last focus passage in Iliad 6 about where Proitos epitele Bellerophon. So it's a very strong word that I see with Mūthos frequently, and I see Mūthos glossed not just as a story or an order, an authoritative order, but also as a threat, like an apele. Cruces is responded to, I think, inappropriately, rudely. He does come with apoina. He comes with a great ransom, and he says, "May you destroy the city of Ilium, which is, or Ilias, which is more in his territory than anything Argive." So I think the Iliad starts out with a very strong rebuff using this word Mūthos, which does seem to be a thematic word of the first, at least the first book of the Iliad, along with apele, where you see in the exchange between Achilles and Agamemnon, I'm going to lay upon you this strong threat. No, it starts out with Achilles saying, "You're going to threaten me to take away my girl," and Agamemnon says, "Damn straight, I'm going to threaten you with taking away your girl." Mm. So I'm reading, quite, as you say, quite a power struggle in this very first exchange, this first scene.
Thank you, Jack. Oh, I'm so sorry, Jack. Yes.
From media, I don't think we should look at the details too strongly, because this is, if you're looking at it as a filmmaker, you're not in real close looking at every little expression and every word. You're looking at it somewhere from mid-range, and you haven't zoomed in yet.
Okay, so this is good. I think we're getting different perspectives here. But I think one thing that's coming out for me, Professor Martin, is the way that you have defined Mūthos in your work as comprising 3 different kinds of speech, right? And I feel like some of that is coming out now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, Claudia. Well, not at length, but essentially you've been focusing on, in these wonderful comments, the first kind of Mūthos, which is the one that opens the poem, and Jack, mentioned the other verb that's used with it, to lay on, to enjoin a Mūthos, which is really an authoritative utterance, a command. That occurs in a lot of the formulas where so-and-so issues a command and the other person almost always just obeys. It's like the command that shuts things down, which is interesting because maybe the etymology of this word Mūthos you can push even further back to a verb that means to close. It's a word that's related to mystery, actually, and to initiation. So that's one big category, and I think it's the one that's kind of underlying the other 2. But as you saw in the other passages, I think, you can also use mythos to mean something like a long story without the idea, at least on the surface, of a command. And you can use it to mean a language of abuse and of kind of trash talking. And you see that a number of times when Achilles is talking to people. He's not telling them to do something, but he's saying, you know, you are such and such a bad warrior, you will never survive. And it's all trash talk, as I say. It's trash talk from 800 BC, perhaps. So the issue then is, how do you fit these three very different senses all together? Is there some concept that we have in English or in French or other languages that still puts these together, or is this just, you know, untranslatable? Do we have to just keep the word in Greek all the time? So, you know, I don't know how people feel about the other passages, but we can proceed through them if you'd like, or we can dwell more on a particular kind of mythos.
That's great. Does anyone, Laura, did you want to proceed or have a question?
Well, I just had a question. I'm wondering, Richard, of the 160 instances of mythos that you found in the Iliad, how many of them were introducing or connected with a micro-narrative?
Yeah, great question. Not many, you know. I would say probably only about 6 or 7.
Oh, really?
And so, I don't know where you're heading exactly, but I can predict one thing. How do we get the word myth, which is like a narrative about the gods, out of this word that seems to mean command or trash talk or story? Well, the story one, as you ask, it is really only a few times in the poems. And one that we have here is that funny scene when Nestor has brought Machaon back to his tent. And it's one of the things that Homeric poetry likes to do, of course, to juxtapose conflict with these kind of off-stage scenes. So they're kicking back in his tent, drinking this wonderful koukeon, which is an awful-sounding mixture of barley and onion and wine. And the poet then says, they fell talking with one another. Mūthos terpanta prosale lus enepontos. Literally, they took pleasure talking to one another. And there's the word in its sense of just like telling long stories. What do you think those stories were? Where they weren't trash talking to each other, they weren't commanding each other. So that's, I think, the kind of micro narrative that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, can we talk about this passage more? Because this is the one that floored me, and we were kind of chatting about it, because it really seemed like, you know, Patroclus says, you know, Achilles is, you know, ever quick to judge and to blame, but yet at the same time he's conveying his Achilles' concern for the warriors. So it was almost like what you say is not what you mean. And this one was a little confusing, but I know Bill had a good theory going too.
Well, I don't know if it was good. It kind of ties into your suggestions. Professor Martin, it ties into your comment that mythos is related to mysteries. When I was reading that concoction they were going to try to choke down, it reminded me of the barley drink that Demeter drank in her hymn, and supposedly that's attached to the mysteries. So
you put your finger on it, because that too is exactly called koukeon. So it's this very distinctive drink that my old teacher, the late Calvert Watkins, compared to soma, the preparation in Vedic India that is supposed to be this magical drink. It's the same sort of very special, maybe healing drink. And we'd love to know more about it, but it only crops up like 2 or 3 times in Greek literature.
So are you saying that this is preparation for having and for beginning an authoritative speech act in this kind of context?
Yeah, this is the beauty of these discussions. I hadn't thought of that until this moment, but
Okay.
I'm thinking of the Odyssey, which you've read, Odyssey Book 4, where Helen comes into a conversation between Menelaus, her husband, and Telemachus, and she slips something into the drink. She slips a potion into the drink, and that kind of enables the conversation, and people tell truth in a way that they wouldn't before. So maybe there's much more going on with the drink and the stories, and maybe the stories, as Bill is saying, have more to do with kind of intimate, maybe even mystery initiation stories. We don't know what the content of those stories is. I would love to know what Nestor said to Macaon. It's like, what song the siren sang.
Right.
Nestor, you remember, goes on and tells this long story himself once Patroclus arrives on the scene. And I've always thought it's very uncomfortable because Patroclus is at the door, and Nestor says, "Come on, have a seat." And Patroclus says, "No, I've got to run. Achilles just sent me to see if Macaon's okay, or who you brought back from the battle." And then Nestor launches into this like 300-line story, all about himself, of course. The point of that story, however, is just as I fought, so Achilles should fight for his community. And there you could claim, well, the Mūthos/long story becomes a kind of Mūthos/command. So you tell stories in order to get somebody to do something.
Right. And so one thing that's interesting to me about that is something you point out in a paper. It's available on academia.edu, where you talk about the movement from myth to mythology. Is this, you've noticed this idea that people are telling these stories to do something, but in fact sometimes it doesn't always. They happen halfway. It might not happen exactly as you want, right? And I know that's something you're still thinking about. And so it brings you back to something you just said too about this idea of closure, about these authoritative speech acts as closure. You make a really interesting argument in your paper about that, and you say that they're not open-ended, they're not boundless, and yet you're pointing us towards a moment where we don't get the story, right? So I'm wondering about that. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I think you formulated beautifully that the story without the frame becomes a kind of myth. So let's think of the story that is told by the stories by Glaucus and Diomedes in Book 6, yet another one of our passages. They come to fight each other, then they try to trash talk. Diomedes says to Glaucus, "Oh, gee, I haven't seen you around before," which is a way of saying, "Hey, you mustn't be a real warrior. Where have you been? You haven't been on the court before." And then they each give a story about where they come from. And Glaucus says, "Well, I'm related to Bellerophon." And he goes into this whole heroic myth, the point of which is to convince somebody of his own authority. So it's one of these stories that makes you do something. Now, what if we just cut away that frame and we just had the story as Glaucus told it, but not knowing that it was in competition with another guy on the battlefield? We would call it a myth. It's kind of harmless. It's an interesting story. Originally, it had the force of this kind of authoritative utterance. And so I think this is where the conclusion comes in. When they are in their framework, they conclude something, they make something happen, they shut down other conversation. When you cut them loose, they become stuff for, Bullfinch's mythology. So it's an interesting art form, kind of speech act. I'm not sure we still have this.
Right. And yet somehow the multiformity of the whole poetic system leaves some kind of opening, right? But not within a particular performance or context. I'm curious to hear what
I mean, think of what was the point. I know we shouldn't interpret poetry as having a message like a sermon, but what was the point? What were the many messages of the Iliad when it was performed, say, in Athens in 600? What were people supposed to do in their lives based on that? Did they just appreciate it as a story? No, I think they thought about, I should be defending the community the way Achilles does, but I should also realize the cost attached to that, and I should value my companion like Patroclus. So there's all kinds of community messages there. We just don't have that frame.
Well, let's turn it back to our community and see what they're thinking about this passage and what we're talking about.
If anyone else, well, I had sorry, I thought D was passage B only with the inclusion of myth. I mean, it seemed like in passage B, Achilles is boasting to Aeneas, I don't know if I pronounced it right, and they're back and they go through their lineage, but it's sort of a straight family tree. But in D, where sorry, I blanked it out.
No, it's okay. So passage B, for people just to know, is Iliad 20, lines 176 through 258. And what we're calling the final passage, I think, or passage C, the one we were just talking about?
The last one in Iliad 6, where Glaucus and Diomedes start trash-talking each other, but then they go through their lineage via the vehicle of myth, and they find that they are from the same community. So myth is almost like a unifier here, rather than, whereas in Iliad 20, it's without myth. There's no resolution. Neither one. Achilles says, "I'm going to kill you," Aeneas says, "I'm going to kill you," and neither kills each other. Whereas Diomedes and Glaucus, through myth, find out they're kind of have a friendship, a family friendship with each other, and so they unite in friendship. They are of one community. That was my impression of that.
The thing I was noticing.
I love the idea of. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just the conversation with Aeneas. The thing that I kept seeing there was phrases like "talk unseemly," and "talk in many ways, all sorts of ways," and "fling taunts." It gave me the impression that they weren't speaking correctly. Thersites, among his many faults, speaks improperly and unseemly. And I was wondering if that was part of the breakdown we're seeing in the conversation here, is that Aeneas is not speaking the way he's supposed to, even in the battlefield.
Yeah, they actually go on to say, what is the use of our bandying hard like women, who when they fall foul of one another, go out and wrangle in the streets, one half true and the other lies, as rage inspires them. So it suggests there that that they're recognizing that they're not speaking true in some way.
Of course, if you're Aeneas, I think we have to ask, what are the stakes for each one of these warriors? Aeneas seems to be saying, let's be man about this. Let's not. I think you're exactly right to point out bandying hard like women. It's an interesting misogynistic take on what women do when they fall foul of one another. They go out and wrangle in the streets. But he's saying, we're not women, so let's just fight each other with spears, which is a dangerous move for Aeneas because he might get killed. And of course, he goes on to found Rome instead. He doesn't get killed. But if you apply that to the passage that Bill and Jackie were talking about, what's in it for Diomedes to tell a story? So I think Jackie's take was very generous and kind. They're forming community. They discover they're related. Do they really discover that they're related? Diomedes says, oh, we're related. But how do we know the truth of his Mūthos? And now I think we can really talk about it as myth. What if he thinks that Glaucus, the new guy on the block, actually might hurt him? And so one way to get out of it is to say, hey, we're related. Let's exchange armor. And then remember what happens? Glaucus says, oh, yeah, good idea. I'll give you my armor, which is worth its weight in gold, and I'll take your armor, which is bronze, which is not as good. So Diomedes gets out of it alive through his storytelling, and he gets a much better set of armor. So that's my more cynical reading of it. And believe me, even in antiquity, people went back and forth on this scene. We know that scholars were constantly debating, is he telling the truth? Is it a good deal? Did Zeus take away the wits of Glaucus? What's going on?
I wonder, since you brought that up, I was thinking about this, the reference to Sisyphus in the in that same passage, and him being the craftiest. And I was thinking, how does that relate to this discussion that Diomedes and Glaucus are having? So he's on the Glaucus's lineage, right, talking about that, but this mention of somebody who is known to be deceitful in some way, or not telling the whole truth, does that set up our expectation that something here is following in that manner?
Very interesting. It never occurred to me. Again, I think Sisyphus, a character in myth. But if you start thinking Sisyphus, a marker for deception. He managed to escape death not 2 times, but I think 3 times by rooking various people. So maybe this is a kind of flashing red light for the whole passage. That certainly puts a different spin on it. I like that.
Thank you. That's beautiful. In fact, we have a comment about that from one of the people who is watching us in the community. And so if you look at the Q&A, you'll see that Jessica Eichelberg is asking us about this, to think about that. And so she's sort of pointing us towards the same thing. She says, what is the community message here in the passage we're discussing, D, which is Iliad 6, 119 through 236? Does Diomedes trick Glaucus into this uneven exchange? Would the Homeric audience laugh and admire some ruse here? And is ruse buried in the retelling and the reshaping of the Bellerophon narrative? So I think we're all sort of on the same page here. While we're at this, can we take another question from our audience? Gabrielle is asking us, is Mūthos a way of explaining the deeper and principal truths of the ancient people? So, I mean, this really gets us really to the heart of your discussion, which is how does this word that comes from this idea of an authoritative speech act and something that's expressing a real truth then become myth as in fiction, right? So can you talk to us a second about that?
Well, this is something... I know,
it's a big topic, right?
When I teach myth, now each year, the first thing I do is a kind of live illustration. I put up on the screen a live Google search page, and you enter the word myth, right? What do you get? The myth of a social welfare net. The myth of, and it's always used in the sense of a widely perceived story that in fact is not true. So it is a fiction. But then enter the word mythic, the adjective, right? And that has no negative implications whatsoever in English. So we've kind of bifurcated the notion into potential lie, great involving epic story, so myth versus mythic. And how did that happen? And I think it has to do with this notion of frame again. Without the frame, a story that makes it like that, that's widespread, but you cannot check. It's not like science. You cannot go back to it. It's like oral culture, where you don't have any written sources to compare. That very quickly gets suspected because people say, oh, it's just a myth. That's your saying. That's your account. But mythic preserves the sense of authoritative, the kind of good sense of that sort of speech act. So it seems to be a human thing to assert, but it's also a human thing to doubt the assertion. And in Western culture, the both of them get preserved in this semantic sphere of myth and mythic. Here's where I throw up my hands. I don't know anything about Chinese or Japanese or a little bit about Sanskrit when it comes to these concepts, but it'd be interesting to do a kind of cross-cultural comparative study on how people perceive utterances of that sort, because I think that might help us, diplomatically at least, in the world at large, to think of how other people perceive long authoritative stories. Does every culture have the notion of a myth?
Yes, I see 2 hands. I see Laura and Sarah. So Laura, would you like to go first?
I was just wondering if we see the same issue with legend and legendary, something that is a legend may or may not be truthful, but if someone does deeds that are legendary, that's usually very complimentary.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's exactly the kind of bifurcation when it comes to meaning. Yeah, yeah. Now, how does that happen? The adjectives are always going to be better, apparently. Epic.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Sarah.
So that actually relates to the question that was starting to formulate in my mind. You were talking about myth versus mythic. We're talking about noun and adjective, but I was also wondering about, in the Greek at any rate, the use of the noun versus the verb. Because in our passage A, it is a noun. He's uttering a Mūthos. And Chryseis is obeying that Mūthos. Mm-hmm. In passages B and C, it's used as a verb. I don't know indeed because it's not highlighted. So I don't know whether, had you noticed any difference between the way they're used in the Greek, whether it's a verb or a noun? And is it ever used as an adjective?
It's not used as an adjective, so that makes that one easy. The verb seems to be more embedded in formulaic phrases, so you have sort of ex mutesastai, and for ex you can put in the word for rebuke, you can put in words for truth, which apparently even bothered ancient scribes, because in another poem, in Hesiod's Theogony, where the muses come down and talk to Hesiod and say, we're going to teach you, and then they say, aleitha gerusastai, which means we're going to teach you to sing the truth. There's a manuscript variant in other manuscripts that say, aleitha mutesastai, we're going to teach you to make a Mūthos about the truth. So apparently some speakers of Greek in antiquity were uncomfortable with the idea that you could aleitha mutesastai, that you could have anything to do with making a Mūthos about the truth, as if they already thought that the word Mūthos meant lie. So basically mutesastai is a little bit more washed out, and it comes to mean something like perform, and then you use it with another noun. So the verb mutesastai, muteomai, can mean like make a performance about, and then you specify with another noun. Is that getting at what you're noticing?
Yeah, and I think that, yes, no, I think that's interesting. It's only just occurred to me to sort of ask that question. So that perhaps that aspect of performance takes it one step away from a truth. It's got an extra layer of something going on. I don't know. It's just something to think with. So thank you.
And it's also, I mean, it reminds us that everything in an oral culture is a performance. You don't write things. I mean, writing introduces this notion of a kind of neutrality, which in an oral culture is never there. You've always got somebody in front of you who wants something, and you can't check out. You can't go to the library and see if his genealogy is actually the way he says it is.
Actually, can I ask about that? Because several of the passages that we're looking at actually do focus on this idea of a genealogy. And I think this last passage, which is passage D, Iliad 6, again, for people who are listening, 119 through 236, one of the verbs that comes up is this verb eukomai, which can be specifically used to by heroes on the battlefield to talk about their genealogy. And so it's interesting, in your paper on myth and mythology, you talk about the difference between writers and about how they might seek authority or claim authority. So I was just wondering about if you could just discuss that a little bit, maybe the relationship between those two. I mean, is there a relationship between this idea of staking a claim to who your forebears are in terms of genealogy and who your intellectual fathers are, or where you're getting your information?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it has to do with that key period when oral culture is moving to written culture. So in an oral culture, how does anyone know who your great-great-grandfather was? well, the community might have this sort of shared idea, but anthropologists have shown in the 20th century that communities can shift their ideas based on what really happens. For example, I think it was in among the Tiv of Nigeria, there were genealogies recorded in the early or late 19th century, and then there were certain interventions by the government, I think it was actually the British at the time, which changed around boundaries of districts and things like that. And when the genealogies were recorded, 40 years later, supposedly the same families, the same genealogies, the genealogies had changed to reflect the new administrative changes that were introduced by this outside power. So genealogies, while we think of them as the ultimate test that somehow you have this ancestry you can remember, actually are as multiform and flexible as everything else in an oral culture. So that's where it really becomes a question of how good a performance can you make about where you come from, and how can you persuade people that your ultimate ancestor was Bellerophon or Sisyphus. They don't have the notion, they don't have pictures that compare and say, oh yeah, you have the same kind of nose as Sisyphus had. We remember that. So it becomes the flashpoint. And we know from people like Herodotus, the historian, that other historians whose work is mostly lost, like Hecataeus, Herodotus knew about this guy, Hecataeus. Hecataeus supposedly traced his own genealogy back to Heracles, 14 generations. Herodotus says, well, I went to Egypt, and I told this to the priests there, and they just laughed because they took me to this hall that they have, and they have statues of their recorded ancestors going back, 3 times as long as Hecataeus, and they hadn't even reached the age of Heracles. So Herodotus is the one that's really interesting on all of this competing stories and falsification of genealogy or wishful thinking when it comes to genealogy. But genealogy and myth making are the closest tied, I think.
So how about?
Sorry.
No, I was going to say I was just going to turn it over to you.
I've just always been as a child, I was really into genealogy research. And if you're just into that sport, then you do other people's genealogies and do research on it. I've always found it amazing that all the royal families of Europe claim descent from Aeneas. Not Julius Caesar or Achilles or somebody really cool, but Aeneas, the guy that had to get rescued repeatedly on the battlefield, and that the Queen of England should be descended from Priam. Is just, I don't know, how as a culture, how do we come up with these ideas and create all those genealogies like you're talking about? They're all out there. It just seems like an odd thing for us to do as people, but we do it.
Yeah, I would say it's not we in a way. It's always one group versus another. So it's not a kind of consensus thing. So the Romans, who happened to have invented the Roman Empire, there wasn't any Greek Empire to speak of. There was an Athenian Empire briefly. The Romans were the winners, and the winners get to write the myths. And so you're going to make everybody come from Aeneas eventually. Julius Caesar, of course, has other claims. He comes from the goddess Aphrodite, from Venus eventually, as does Aeneas. So they're related. Then there are weird medieval variations. The Britons coming from Brutus. I do Celtic things on the side, and you think that these French and British etymologies are wild. The Irish have like 5 different waves of invaders to explain all of the different family complications. So myth just explodes once you start getting into genealogy.
So that kind of actually brings me back to another question about that scepter that you were pointing us to actually in the first focus passage that we read, which is that scepter, because that also has sort of a genealogy attached to it, right?
That's right. Yeah, and it's not just people. So the scepter goes all the way back to Zeus eventually, and so this is the kind of thing that again involves a story. You pick up an object, you say, you see this scepter here? Well, once upon a time, Hephaestus made it for Zeus. It was given to Hermes. It was passed down through the following people, and I've got it. It's like an apostolic succession. So there's only one scepter. What are you going to do? Pull another scepter out of the closet and say, no, my scepter comes from, and then, of course, you can't get better than Zeus. So these props kind of support the myth. So think of what a gutsy move it is when then Achilles takes the scepter and throws it to the ground. And even the poet notices this in this long speech where Achilles compares it to a tree that's sort of withered. So he's just undercutting the whole system there, saying, your prop means nothing to me.
Right. That's amazing. So does anyone else have any thoughts about the focus passages that we read or questions about Mūthos or mythology? Maybe someone we haven't talked to? Yes, Janet, please.
Hi, this is Janet from New York. I'm thinking about the working procedure of Mūthos in the performance, and can we treat Mūthos as information stations for the audience? And Bart is saying, listen to me now carefully, because what I'm going to say is going to relate to something else. Can we treat Mūthos like that? And my second question, okay, let's go with the first one.
Well, yeah, I think this is it's really interesting question of performance again. So Mūthos, I agree, is a kind of focusing device. As soon as the poet says it or has some character say it, it is a kind of meta signal to the audience. Okay, this is an important speech. And I say that knowing that there's another word that could be used, which is epos, E-P-O-S. So there are really two words for speech in Homer. Epos, which I also investigated, is the word that gives us epic, but it means basically common speech, any kind of speech. It's the unmarked, whereas Mūthos is the marker. So I think you're exactly right, Janet, that this is a way of signaling to the audience, important information coming up. At the same time, does the audience ever get to the stage of thinking, this epic as a whole might be a Mūthos, and it might or might not be true? Well, the poet covers himself there by saying, this is what the muses told me. So I've got this directly from the muses. And we just don't know whether there are audience members who think, yeah, or there are audience members who think, oh, okay, it's from the muses. We've got to believe it.
So it seems like it's about creating that kind of connection to a source of authority too, right? It's always staying connected in a way.
Well, but I think, to Dr. Janet, it's both axes, a connection to the audience and a connection to the source of your information. So you're constantly negotiating. I've got it from the gods. I'm transmitting it to you. And the hidden logical tie is because it's from the gods, you should believe it. But there might be some slippage there.
I was wondering about the relationship of Mythos to, I think the word's anos, a signifier of wisdom literature. Is there a connection there? If there is,
there are now so many speech words that one could come up with, because there's also logos, but it only occurs 3 times. Ainos or enos is different. It's the word that gives us enigma, ultimately, riddle, and I think it is a kind of communication that advertises itself as not easy to interpret. So here's an ainos, and then you tell a kind of animal fable or an allegory or something like that. It's not the sort of straight out authoritative speech that you assert. It's more in the middle, like, try to figure this out. There aren't too many Ainaa Ainoi in the poem, I have to say. That's more lyric poetry.
With the exception of Nestor giving advice on horse racing, right?
Well, yeah, that I don't know whether that is enigmatic and the son misinterprets it, or whether it's very clear and the son intentionally misinterprets it. That's a good question. Nestor is this master of genres, so it could well be that he's got an Ainos there.
I just bring it up because it's been a subject of debate for years among us.
Yeah, this is such a great community. First of all, I wish you were all my students and we could get together every week and talk about the Iliad like this. But I envy you for having, this bond about the poems.
We can set that up if you want to join us every week.
Well, it's not 8 in the morning. Then I could perhaps do it. But.
So I think, Laura, did you have your hand up, Laura? Did you still have something you'd like to share?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on Ainos. I don't think that Richard mentioned Aesop in his article on mythographers, and I was wondering if he considers Aesop a mythographer. And in the Phaedo, when Socrates, on his last day, is putting some verses of Aesop, putting a tale of Aesop into verse, he uses Mūthos and not Ainos. So do you make anything of that?
Wow. Again, I haven't thought deeply about Aesop because my colleague and friend Leslie Kirk, whom I saw yesterday up in Berkeley, I just defer to her on all things Aesopic, and she has this wonderful book, Aesopic Conversations, all about the figure of Aesop. One of the things that she wants to say is that Aesop is the kind of inventor of prose, or prose as a genre, which is opposed to poetry, starts with this figure who kind of tells the truth that power doesn't want to hear. So in that understanding, it's kind of anti-mythos. But maybe if you're anti-mythos, you become a myth maker on your own. I think she would say that he's not a mythographer. I would say that he's been hijacked by mythographers to assert messages that they want to say. And then when you come to Socrates, what does it mean for him to be making a mythos? Is he transforming something that was kind of lower down on the genre scale and making it more important? Which is kind of what Socrates does. He takes the common, ordinary thing and then relates it to ultimately the other world, the forms. So that's a great question, which I think might require another book. Not by me. Maybe you can do it.
That's a good plan. So we have a few minutes left. I was wondering, could we look at some of the questions we still have in the Q&A? Richard, is that okay?
Yeah.
So if you go to the left,
Q&A.
yeah. So I can read a couple of questions, or also if you move your cursor to the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a bar that comes up, and you'll see a blue Q&A box. So we have a question from Renan. He's asking us to think some more about the scepter, actually, in 2 questions, it looks like. So first he asks us, maybe the scepter of Apollo that Chryses brings to supplicate a king has an important message, but he says he can't figure it out just yet. And then there's a bit more. Apollo is the leader of the Muses, and his scepter, possessed by Chryses, announces the beginning of his Mūthos against the Achaeans, his command that will lead to the will of Zeus of the Epos. I'm sorry if I am misreading that. His command that will lead to the will of Zeus, I think, of the Epos. So we're thinking about the scepter and about Apollo.
Well, I see. Okay, so this is a different scepter. So there are kind of competing scepters, now that you mention it. There is the Scaptron that Chryses brings. I think by Scaptron of Apollo, it's a little bit different. It's the one that symbolizes his role as priest of Apollo.
Mhm.
But it would be interesting to know whether they somehow thought that this was given by Apollo to, an ancestor priest. I don't think we have any information about that in the ancient notes in the Scholia. Whereas the scepter of Agamemnon, we have the genealogy. So if you look at it this way, and now I'm thinking of Jack's comments about filmmaking, it would be a beautiful moment of a filmic kind of contrast to have the two scepters sort of in the frame, the one of Apollo and Chryses and the one of Agamemnon, which ultimately Odysseus will use in Book 2 to start whacking people over the back. So it is a scepter battle after all.
Mm. So interesting. And again, those scepters, I mean, those are often passed from father to son, right? That's often the message we get about scepters.
That's
so we have genealogy there. And I'm also seeing sort of categories of people, right? We're seeing kings, we're seeing priests, poets, right? All these scepter bearers. I mean, do you see a connection between Mūthos and these scepter bearers?
Well, to go back to one of the very first things that was observed in the chat, the scepter of the priest has more resonance in a way because, okay, Agamemnon can make a Mūthos. The priest can silently obey that Mūthos, but then he immediately goes to, how was it put by, I think, Jackie, the higher power, the boss. And so it's like the scepter becomes a megaphone. He doesn't speak into it, but the power of the scepter amplifies your Mūthos. And therefore, I see more and more that there is this mythic theme of the king and the priest, which you can find in a lot of mythologies worldwide. Who really has power? Is it secular? Is it religious? Is it the warrior, or is it the sort of spiritual man or woman? And we see that played out day after day, even in the news. Is it Mother Teresa? Is it that kind of power, or is it Vladimir Putin? There's a meeting of the minds.
Right. And one more, I think, and here's a big question for us to finish on. We have just 2 minutes left, so maybe we could just talk very briefly about this. So Georgios is writing to us, and he says, "Warm greetings from Greece." Very lucky man, I have to say. I have a question concerning myth and its connection with fate. If the origins of myth stem from tradition itself, is it possible for a hero to go against their own fate, as foreseen by myth? Are there any relevant examples?
Well, Faristopoli, Yorio, it's an interesting question, and my initial response would be, that's how we know about heroes. They're the ones who are always going against what is perceived to be fate. Of course, if you get me going on fate, I would end up saying fate itself is often a construction of individual assertions or mythos. And fate doesn't really exist. It's just what people happen to say rhetorically. Oh, it was fated, like, oh, the devil made me do it. So the people who don't go against fate, in a way, we never hear about. It's only the wrench in the machine, the kind of thing that sticks in the cogs that we hear about, the thing that resists, like Robert Frost's rock in the river that makes the current push back. That would be my brief answer.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Martin. It's 12 o'clock, so we should really sign off. We so appreciate your time today. I always appreciate the time of the community members, of people who join us in the middle of their days to come talk about the Iliad and the Odyssey, this ancient literature.
It's incredibly touching, and thank you so much, Claudia, for being such a good mediatrix, and thank you, everybody in the community. Happy lunchtimes, dinner times. It's breakfast for me now.
Yeah.
And regards from San Francisco.
Take great care, and I hope you can join us again.
I hope so. Take care.